Hey everyone, welcome back. Now, as some of my regular viewers may have noticed, I haven't been producing videos for a while. I took a little break from producing videos, and there's a couple reasons for that. And one of the reasons is because I've been exploring actually something new for me, which is another old computer. So it's not something new originally, but it's something new as far as I'm concerned, which is the Mattel Aquarius computer, which is right here. So some of you may be familiar with this computer and others of you may not be. So first of all, let me explain why I got interested in this computer to begin with. As regular viewers to my channel will know, this channel was set up to document my journey of developing games for the ZX Spectrum Next computer. But as I've learned along the way, the ZX Spectrum Next computer can be not that easy to learn how to develop games for, in terms of getting the development environment configured on your computer and getting everything you need to actually prepare to make some games and programs for the ZX Spectrum Next. As well as the ZX Spectrum Next, although it's a fantastic computer for developing games, because it has all sorts of enhanced and upgraded features that are really suitable for game developers. Things such as hardware sprites, different video modes, lots of memory, lots of speed, different things that really make it pleasurable and very enticing for game developers to want to develop games for the ZX Spectrum Next. And that's why I was looking at developing games for it. But along the way, I've kind of taken a bit of a side detour, which is looking at this Mattel Aquarius computer, and I'll tell you why I actually got involved in looking at it to begin with. So in general, I'm not particularly interested in developing games on actual old computer hardware and purchasing old computer hardwares such as the Aquarius. In fact, I've never even heard of the Aquarius up until recently. But the reasons that I generally am not interested in developing games on old hardware such as the Aquarius, or even the original Sinclair Spectrum computers, or any other computers that were developed back in the day, back in the 80s, is because of the limitations that they have that make it very difficult to develop programs and games for them. And of course, I'm sure many of you are already familiar with these limitations. Things such as the keyboard, the rubber chiclet keys on these old computers can be very difficult to use, and some of the membrane keyboards are also very difficult to use. But in fact, this keyboard on the Mattel Aquarius, this rubber chiclet style keyboard, is probably, in my opinion, the worst keyboard of all the computers I've ever used for typing on, and I certainly wouldn't want to try to program a game on that actual keyboard for any length of time. But we'll get back to this computer in a moment. So as I was saying, in general, the limitations that have kept me from looking at actual old hardware are things like the keyboard is difficult to type on. These old computers are designed to connect to an old-fashioned television using a regular RF video signal, which is not the greatest, particularly compared to our modern computers using HDMI signals. And there are other limitations as well, such as storing your programs onto audio cassette tape can be a very slow and painful process, and it can be unreliable, and it can be very frustrating to try and develop using an audio cassette tape for storing your programs. As well as there are some other limitations such as speed and memory, as well as just the hardware being old itself tends to wear out. So if you do purchase an old computer such as this one, you probably want to look at things like replacing the capacitors on the circuit board, because the capacitors tend to dry out and wear out, and they can potentially cause damage to other more critical parts inside the computer. So as you can see, there are lots of potential limitations when it comes to wanting to develop games on the actual old computer such as this Mattel Aquarius. So now let's talk a little bit about why I got involved with the Aquarius to begin with. Why am I even interested in the Aquarius? Well, as we're going to find out in a moment, due to some modern developments that have been made for this computer recently, this computer has actually turned into a very interesting computer that has, in my opinion, an untapped potential for game development. And some of those limitations that we just discussed, and perhaps all of them, have been actually addressed and pretty much eliminated by these modern developments that have been made by some of these very smart people who have ingeniously come up with these ways of getting around these limitations and really providing some enhancements to this computer that make it really enticing for, well, game developers such as myself. I now think that this computer is really an untapped gem that is ideal, particularly for beginners wanting to get into game development and programming in general. So let's take a look at some of these limitations and how they've been overcome with these recent developments. Alright, so here's a look at the Mattel Aquarius computer on the screen now. And before we get into the specifications of the computer, let me talk a little bit about why I got involved with this computer to begin with. And actually, I became interested in this computer from a video that a friend of mine made that I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with, TJ Ferreira. He has been making videos for a long time on YouTube, and he's actually made several previous videos about the Mattel Aquarius computer, talking about the computers that he's purchased for his own collection and what he's been doing with them. But as I said, I've never really been interested in exploring actual old computers such as this because of those limitations I discussed previously. However, one of the videos that he made recently was again about this computer, and he was basically saying this is a cool little computer, it's a neat computer to take a look at, and it has a very fun Facebook group with some interesting people in it that are doing some really cool things with this computer. And so he was basically inviting people to come and take a look at this computer, check it out, check out the group, and join the group and see what it's all about. And I was actually already a member of this Facebook group for the Mattel Aquarius computer, but like I said, I hadn't really been involved in it because it is an actual old computer that has these limitations. However, I decided to go check it out and learn a little bit more about it, learn a little bit more about the group and the things that the people in this group have been and are doing with this computer in modern times nowadays. And the more I started to learn about this computer, the more interested I became. So before I get into the details of what possibilities I see there are for this computer in terms of game development, particularly for beginners, but for anyone really, it's actually a very interesting platform, as I've discovered, for game development, and I'll explain why in a moment. But before we get into that, let's take a look at some of the specifications of this computer and exactly what it is all about and what you can expect if you were to own one of these computers. So first of all, let's take a look at this picture on the screen that I have here, and you can see that this computer has an extra add-on that is not part of the computer that I showed you that I have in my collection, which is this extra sidecar thing here, which is called the Mini-expander. So before we get into taking a look at that, let's just talk about the specifications for the computer itself, which is, as you saw before, it has this rubber chiclet style keyboard, but we're going to explain how to get around that limitations a bit later. So that's the first thing to be aware of is the keyboard. Now the keyboard can also enter the keywords for you automatically. There is an overlay that goes on top of the keyboard that has, well, you probably won't be able to see it well in my tiny video here, but this is the overlay, and as you may be able to see, it has some keywords written above these little holes for some of the keys. And the reason for that is because some of the keys can be combined with a control key. So when you press the control key, it automatically generates the keyword for you, so you don't have to type in the entire keyword when you're programming in BASIC. Now that can save you some time and effort, but you don't have to use that feature. You can also type in the full keywords if you want. Now let's talk about some of the limitations of this computer, technically speaking. And probably the largest limitation is the memory. It comes installed with 4K of RAM memory, and 4K of memory is not a lot of memory for any computer, even a retro computer. And what makes it even worse is the 4K of memory inside this computer also includes the video memory, which is the memory that the computer needs in order to generate graphics and text on the screen. So when the computer is finished using up all the memory that it needs to perform its functions, the user is only left with 1.7 kilobytes of RAM or memory to create programs, which is extremely small. However, we're going to talk about how we get around that limitation as well a bit later. So the computer comes with 4K of RAM, Pretty poor keyboard. And what else can we expect from this computer? Well, we know that it already has a video signal that uses RF video to connect to a normal television set. It has this sidecar that I mentioned briefly a moment ago, which you can see on the screen here now. And let's talk a bit more about that. So what this sidecar gives you, and again, this sidecar is called the Mini-expander. And what it does for you is it gives you, first of all, 2 cartridge slots. As you can see here, these black things plugged into it, there are 2 of them. These are cartridges that would normally plug into the place where this Mini-expander is plugged into the side of the computer here. And of course, normally the cartridge would allow you to either run a game, it would have a game on it, or it might just be a memory expansion module that allows you to create larger basic programs. But when you plug in this sidecar expansion or this Mini-expander, what it does is allows you to install 2 cartridges at once. However, those 2 cartridges are typically going to be a game in the front slot here, as well as in the back you would plug in a cartridge for memory expansion, which would allow you to play games that require more than that 1.7K of RAM that the computer normally gives you without any memory expansion. So that's what this sidecar or this Mini-expander gives you. In addition to, you can see these 2 controllers here, these hand controllers, which are also plugged into this Mini-expander. And that is actually the only way that you can use hand controllers with this computer the way that it is produced, because the controllers don't plug into the actual computer by itself without this Mini-expander present. So if you want to use hand controllers with this computer, you pretty much have to purchase this Mini-expander, which will give you ports that allows you to plug in these hand controllers. Now, I don't actually own either this mini controller or these hand controllers, and I'll explain why in a moment. But although I haven't actually used these hand controllers, they don't seem like controllers that I would particularly enjoy using. I prefer to use a normal joystick when I'm controlling a game. And these ones use an Intellivision style disc, as you can see, in combination with some more of these horrible blue rubber chiclet keys. So again, we're going to take a look at how we can get around this limitation as well. So this is the computer in a nutshell. If you were to purchase a computer like this with this Mini-expander and some cartridges and some hand controllers, you would get a setup pretty much like what you're seeing on the screen here. Now let's take a look at why I find this computer so interesting and intriguing in terms of game development and what I've learned about it. So first of all, let's take a look at these limitations and how we can get around them. So one limitation that the computer has, of course, is the processor. And this computer operates on a Z80 microprocessor, which runs at about 3.5 megahertz. Now, there's nothing really that can be done about that. It is what it is. It runs at that particular speed. It can't be increased. But there is obviously a way to get around that. If you're going to be programming in, let's say, machine code, then that will run a lot faster than a basic program that you might create. However, its normal speed limitation is about 3.5 megahertz with this Z80 microprocessor. So what makes this computer interesting now? Well, as I mentioned briefly, there have been some recent tools and developments made by some pretty clever people specifically for this computer, which in my mind makes this computer much more usable and much more enticing as a game development machine, and particularly for beginners. And the first thing I want to describe is the final limitation about this computer when it comes to game development, which is the graphics capabilities. So what I mean by that is, for example, if you take a look at the Sinclair Spectrum computer, it has what's known as bitmapped graphics, meaning that the graphics that you see on the screen, they correspond to memory locations in the computer memory, and depending what values you put in the memory locations, that determines what patterns of graphics show up on the screen. The Sinclair Spectrum has something called user-defined graphics, which allows you to program your own graphics, patterns, and images. And if you're interested in learning about that, you can take a look at the video I made about that, about making your own user-defined graphics characters. However, the Mattel Aquarius computer doesn't have any programmable graphics capabilities whatsoever. But before I get into that, let me just mention one thing that we need to be aware of when we're talking about the Mattel Aquarius computer and its technical specifications. One thing to be aware of is that the Aquarius computer was actually made and manufactured by a company called Radifin. But Mattel had the rights to sell the computer, and it was actually sold under the Mattel name. And so you'll see on some computers it actually says Mattel Aquarius on it, on the label, and others don't. Others just say Aquarius. So you'll see some computers have the label Mattel Electronics above the Aquarius badge on the front of the computer, and others don't. So the ones that say Mattel obviously were marketed by Mattel, and the ones that don't were marketed directly by Radifin after Mattel gave up the rights to sell this computer when it wasn't doing very well. So one thing to be aware of is that there are two versions of this computer as far as the ROM goes. There's a version S1 ROM and a version S2 ROM. And the versions that were marketed by Mattel could be either an S1 or an S2 version, and the Radifin versions that were marketed without the Mattel branding were all S2 versions as far as I'm aware, because by the time that Radifin regained the rights to sell this computer after Mattel gave them up, by that time the computer had been developed to the point where all of them were S2 ROM versions. So basically, if you buy a computer that doesn't have the Mattel logo branding on it, it should be an S2 version. Whereas if you buy one that has the Mattel logo on it, it may be either an S1 version or an S2 version. And why is that important? Well, the S2 version is the more recent version. It has better compatibility with modern enhancements. And if you're not sure whether you have an S1 version or an S2 version, the way you can tell is simply by powering it on and looking at the image on the screen. So if you take a look at the copyright image that shows up on the screen, it will either have nothing next to it or it will have S2 next to it. So if it says S2, obviously that's an S2 version. If it doesn't show any version, then that would be an S1 version. Now let's get back to the user-definable graphics, or lack of definable graphics, as I mentioned a moment ago. So this computer has something known as character graphics, which means that you cannot define your own graphics characters or your own graphics patterns. It does have some, not really pixel graphics, but it has some bloxel graphics that are usable by the program developer. But the bloxel graphics are larger than pixels, and so they're kind of clunky. So if you want to make any graphics using these bloxels, they're not going to be as finely resolved as pixels. So it makes the resolution lower when we're trying to make our own custom-defined graphics. And other than that, we're restricted by the graphics that come pre-built into the computer. And these are various shapes that are defined inside the computer. Things like a little person, little block shapes, and other types of shapes that we can use to make up our games. So when we're defining any graphics for our games for this computer, we are limited to using the graphics that are pre-installed in the computer. And each graphics character takes up one character position. Which brings us to another limitation of this computer, which is the way that graphics are displayed on the screen. So as with the Sinclair Spectrum computer, for example, which has bitmapped graphics, you can print the graphics pretty much anywhere you want on the screen using clever programming and mathematical formulas to determine where you're going to be plotting individual pixels on the screen. However, with the Mattel Aquarius, it doesn't have bitmapped graphics, it has character graphics, which means the screen is divided into a grid of characters. So any graphics or characters that we want to print on the screen have to fall within those character grids. So if we want to have a graphics character moving smoothly from one side of the screen to the other, for example, we can't do that because these characters must fit into these individual character positions on the screen, into this grid of positions on the screen. They would be printed in one character position or another. So again, you wouldn't be able to scroll smoothly from one character position to the next. All right, so now that we've discussed most of the limitations of this computer, let's take a look at some of the modern enhancements and developments that have been made for this computer that allows us to easily get around pretty much all of these limitations and gives us the capability to produce some really, I think, impressive games for this computer now. These are capabilities that have never existed up until this point, and so this, I think, is a really exciting time for particularly beginning game developers to get into developing games for this Mattel Aquarius computer. So first of all, let's talk about that limitation we just mentioned about the character graphics. Now, although that might seem like a limitation, and it is a limitation in a sense, it also can be a benefit for beginning programmers in that we no longer have to worry about trying to design our own intricate graphics patterns. So for example, if you think about even just a single character square, a single 8x8 character graphics square, which has 8 pixels by 8 pixels, which gives you 64 pixels to play with. If you think about the combinations that those pixels can be in, that gives you 2 to the 63rd power of different combinations, which is a huge number. I mean, 2 to the 15th power is 65,000 different combinations. So you can imagine how large a number is 2 to the 63rd power. It's an absolutely staggering number of combinations. So if you think about trying to design your own graphics for a game, it can be quite an intimidating task when you think about even one character graphics position can have 2 to the 15th different combinations of bit patterns. And this is just talking about black and white bit patterns. Either the bit is turned on or turned off. Now, if you bring color into the equation, that increases the number of combinations dramatically. So it's just a mind-boggling, staggering number of different combinations that we're able to create for even a single 8x8 character square. So with the Mattel Aquarius computer, on the other hand, we no longer have to worry about creating our own graphics. We don't have to create our own custom designed shapes because we can't. We're limited to using the pre-installed graphics shapes that come with the computer. So if we look at it in that way, that can be an actual benefit in that we don't have to worry about creating our own intricately custom designed graphics patterns. Now, before I change my screen back into the other mode where we can see the screen sharing mode, I want to show you one device close up here while I'm in my large screen mode that has been a real game changer when it comes to development for this Mattel Aquarius computer. And that is a device known as the Micro-Expander that was developed by Bruce Abbott. And there's actually an article about this showing his development process on the AtariAge forum, which I'll put a link down to in the video description below as well. But let me show you this device. So here is the device known as the Micro-Expander. And this is essentially a cartridge or an expansion circuit board that fits into the cartridge slot of the Mattel Aquarius. And let's take a look at this device and what features and benefits it gives us. So if you take a look at the top here, first of all, you'll see we have an AY sound chip, which gives us full AY sound capability, which actually the Mini-expander sidecar module also gives us. But this gives us the AY sound capability as well. So with this, we don't need the Mini-expander module to give us that enhanced sound capability. As well as this device also gives us 32K of memory, 32K of RAM. So in this device, we now have a RAM expansion that gives us up to 32K of RAM memory as opposed to the 4 kilobytes or 1.7 usable kilobytes of RAM that comes pre-installed with the Aquarius computer. So with this, we no longer need extra expansion memory modules because we have 32K of RAM built right into it. But in addition to that, on the back here, we also have a USB port. And what does the USB port give us? Well, of course, that allows us to connect USB drives to this device, which really means we have no memory limitation at all anymore because we can save and load programs and data to this USB drive that we have plugged in here. So if you think about it, and I'm going to demonstrate this to you a little bit later, but what this means is we can essentially have as much data or as many programs as we want on a USB drive that's connected to this port because we can simply load more games automatically or load more programs automatically from within a program that's automatically running. We can load data and have it displayed directly on the screen. So this, in my mind, is a huge game changer, which allows us to really have limitless memory when it comes to creating programs and games for our Mattel Aquarius computer because we now have USB capability and the memory limitation is now been increased from 1.7 kilobytes of memory to however large a USB stick is that we shove into this port, which is incredible. Now let's take a look at this next port over here right next to the USB port, and this is a controller port. So remember those controllers we took a look at before, and I know some people might enjoy using those hand controllers, but for myself, as I mentioned, I prefer using a regular joystick, although this port allows you to plug in hand controllers to this Micro-Expander device. You will need to have an adapter cable to allow you to connect those hand controllers. And that is what I have right here. I have actually made an adapter cable that allows hand controllers to be connected to this port, and it simply has a connector on one end that plugs into this port right here. So it plugs in like that, and then on the other end it's actually split into two cables, and the other end of those two cables give you controller ports, which is where you would plug in those standard Mattel Aquarius hand controllers to. However, if you don't happen to want to use those regular Aquarius hand controllers and you prefer to use a regular joystick, we also have an option for that now, which you can do by creating an adapter cable such as this one. So you can see here I've built an adapter cable where one end gives you a regular DB9 connector, which allows you to plug in a regular Atari style joystick, and the other connector plugs into the controller connector port on this adapter cable. So now we have our micro-expander circuit board assembly connected to regular hand controller cables that allow you to connect this adapter cable, which gives you the functionality of plugging in a regular Atari style joystick, which is huge. So there is one limitation with this Atari style adapter connector, which is the hand controllers for the Aquarius have more directions than a regular Atari joystick does. But obviously a regular Atari style joystick only has up, down, left, right, and then the intermediate diagonal directions, which would be 8 different directions. Although many of the games will work with a regular Atari style joystick, that is one limitation, in that if you're going to be using a regular Atari style joystick for existing games, you're only going to be able to use it for those 4 vertical and horizontal directions plus the intermediate diagonal directions, whereas the regular disc controller for the Aquarius has 16 individual directions. But if you're going to be programming your own games, you can easily program them, of course, to use the 8 directions that an Atari joystick gives you. Plus, you can also use 2 buttons if you want with this adapter cable. So those 6 buttons that come on a regular Aquarius hand controller, you can map 2 of them to use on Atari style joystick. So that means you can actually use a joystick that has 2 fire buttons on it if you want, and that will work with this adapter cable as well. So this is a huge advancement in the Mattel Aquarius game development arena. This, in my mind, is a game changer. And so I just wanted to give you a view of this device before I change my screen mode again, so you can see what it looks like. Now, the other thing I want to mention about this is how can you get one? Well, there's, as far as I know, really only 3 ways you can get one. You can't just go out and buy one. They're not readily available. So you either have to build one yourself, or you need to find someone who's willing to sell you one, or you need to find someone who's willing to build you one. Now, luckily, the plans for building this are available online, and you can order the circuit boards for building this, as well as the parts. There are a couple issues with trying to build your own, such as some of the parts that you order could potentially be fake parts that you get from overseas, so they might not necessarily work. One of the parts comes in a couple different configurations, so you need to make sure that you get the correct configuration that works with this board. And some of the parts actually require to be programmed. So these 2 parts here actually need to be programmed. So in order to use this device with your Mattel Aquarius computer, you need to have the ability to either program these chips yourself, or you need to be able to purchase them from someone who's already pre-programmed them for you. But again, the code to put in these chips is available online, and if you know how to program them, then that may not be an issue for you. Now let's take a look at some of the other advancements that have been made for this computer that make it really exciting in terms of game development. Alright, so the next thing let's talk about is let's take a look at the issue of that rubber keyboard. Now, if we want to develop games for the Mattel Aquarius, obviously one way we can do it is just by turning on the computer and start typing away on that keyboard. But that's possibly not the best way to do it, or the most convenient and easy way to do it. Luckily, there is a way around that keyboard, which is by using an emulator. So there is an emulator available that you can run on your regular PC computer. I'm not sure if it's available for the Mac computer as well, or Linux. It may be, but I'm using it on a Windows computer, and it is an emulator called AquaLite. And I'll put a link to that in the video description as well. And let me just bring it up on my screen here. So here is the AquaLite emulator, which emulates the Mattel Aquarius computer, or the Radifin Aquarius computer. So this isn't going to be an in-depth tutorial about how to use the emulator, but the point in showing you this is the reason this is such a huge advantage for us is obviously we get to use a regular PC to develop our games, and we can use a regular PC keyboard, and you can see what a clear image we're getting here from this emulator. So this makes it a real joy to develop for this computer, and I may make a future video about the development process to show how exactly I've been developing a game that I'm working on for this computer after finding out about all these wonderful game-changing developments that really make it enticing to develop games for this Mattel Aquarius computer. So here we have the emulator you can see on the screen, and this AquaLite emulator is unique in that it actually emulates not just a regular Mattel Aquarius computer, but it also emulates the Micro-Expander functionality. And before I get any further, I just want to give credit to the person who developed this emulator, whose name is Richard Chandler, as you see here. So he developed this emulator, and it is an absolutely fantastic tool to use for game development. It's a real game changer, as I mentioned, particularly since it has this functionality of the Micro-Expander board set that I just showed you. And the way we activate that is simply by going up here to Tools, selecting Options, and then under Options you go over here to this Peripherals tab, and you can see the Micro-Expander selection right here. You just turn that on and click OK. And then you can see it brings up the boot menu for the Micro-Expander board. So if you happen to have one of these Micro-Expander accessories, this is the menu that will show up when you power on the computer with the Micro-Expander installed. So here you can see it gives you a few options: load ROM, debug, PT3 player. But when we're doing development on it, what we want is to program in BASIC, if we're going to be programming in BASIC, that is. So here you can see if I press the return key, it will bring me into BASIC. And you can see here it's listed as USB Basic. So USB Basic is another cool enhancement of the Micro-Expander device, which gives us a new version of BASIC to work with, which gives us more commands and improved functionality. And in particular, it allows us to load and save data to a USB memory stick, which is huge. And you can also see up here, it shows you the S2 version for the ROM. So that means we're working with the S2 ROM version in this emulator. And we can simply start typing in a basic program if we want. Just like that. And one other functionality that this gives us, as I mentioned, is it gives us that very powerful ability to load and save data from a USB drive. And this gives us the capability of a USB drive built in. So for example, if we take a look at the files that I've saved on my computer, I'll just type dir. And you can see all of these files that I've saved. These are files that I can load from within a program. I can load them directly. And so really we really have no more memory limitation when it comes to making games for the Aquarius. And you can see these files in particular, they have an extension called SCR, which is short for screen, which means these are data files that I'm using as screen images. So this brings us to another point that I'm going to be discussing next, which is creating our own graphics for this computer using those built-in graphics characters. So there is another incredible tool that has been developed by someone called Matt Pilz, and it is another game changer in the game development arena for the Mattel Aquarius, which is that it allows us to design our own graphic screen images using these built-in characters. Now, typically it's been very difficult to design graphics images for this computer without any kind of graphic development tool. But this tool that he's designed, called Aquarius Draw, and it's an online tool available from his website, and I'll show it to you in a moment. It allows us to very easily develop these amazing images for this computer. And now, so let me show you how the images can be loaded directly to the screen using this micro-expander capability. So all I have to do is type load, and then I'll type the name. So let's just pick one at random here. Let's say I'll pick this one, 030401, and that's just simply the name that I've given this particular file. So I'll load this file, 030401, and it has an SCR extension, so I'll put .scr, and then now I'm going to put a comma, and I'm going to tell the computer that I want to load this data file to a section of memory that corresponds to the screen image, and the screen on the Mattel Aquarius begins at address 12288. So I'm going to enter that here in this command, and so now what's going to happen is it's going to load this data into the screen memory in the computer, and it should display hopefully a nice image for us. So let's give it a try. So this is a landscape image that I've made for a game that I'm working on. And let's just try loading a different image that might be a bit more impressive. So this time let's load a different image, maybe 030404 .scr, comma 12288, which is the beginning of the video memory, and we'll see what this looks like. So here you can see I've got an image of a church that I've made with some water in the foreground, and a little bush over on the side, and part of a house on the right side here with the moon showing in the background and some stars. So these are the kinds of cool images that we can now make using Matt's impressive tool. So now let's take a look at Matt's tool and how easy it is to make one of these images. So the way we get to that is, and I'll put a link to it in the video description, is we go to this website, and you can see up here the website is called aquarius.mattpilz.com/draw, and this is what the screen looks like. So here you can see we have a template or a backdrop that we can use for designing images. And without going into too much detail about how to use this tool, all the instructions are on the website. But basically all we need to do is select some characters from over on the left side here. Let's say I select this heart here, and it shows us a preview of the heart down at the bottom. Right now it's printing on black ink on a blue background. And we can change the foreground ink at the top and the background ink on the second row at the top here. And now we can simply print these or position these characters wherever we want on the screen. And this is a really cool and useful tool for creating these images like I'm making for my game. And there are some neat features to this tool where you can fill the entire background, you can fill the entire foreground, you can fill characters on the entire screen. You can do all kinds of amazing things with this tool that really allows us to make some cool images. So let me just load one of the images that I've made, which is this image here, which is simply an outdoor nighttime image that I was playing around with. There's a little entrance over here with our little man on the screen. Here is a chest that contains different goodies and some bushes in the background. And I was experimenting with the health bar and some different images up at the top of the screen here. So this is a fantastic tool that now allows us to get around that limitation of having to work with these built-in characters that come with the Mattel Aquarius computer. So now that we have these incredible ways to get around pretty much most of the limitations of this Aquarius computer, we no longer have memory limitation because of this USB drive capability. We also have a 32K of RAM built into the Micro-Expander expansion board module. We have the ability to connect not only the regular hand controllers for the Aquarius, but now we can also connect regular Atari style joysticks to our computer. We have this fantastic Aquarius Draw tool for laying out and designing these full screen cool graphic images for our games. We have the ability to instantly load those graphics to the screen using the Micro-Expander module. And of course we have the fantastic AquaLite Emulator that we can use to program our games on our regular PC computers. Alright, so now that we have all these fantastic options available to us with these modern tools that make development much easier for this Mattel Aquarius computer, we really have the capabilities of producing, I think, some impressive games that have never been seen before on this computer, which makes it a really untapped treasure, I think, for game developers like us. So the question becomes, should we actually buy one of these computers now and buy or build one of these Micro-Expander modules to go along with it? This is one that I've built. I actually was trying to buy one, but it's, like I said, it's not easy to find someone to sell a micro-expander, but if you can find one, then you can just go ahead and buy one readily built. I was actually able to find someone to sell me one eventually, but I was already halfway through building my own at that point, so this is kind of the cobbled together one that I built myself, which works perfectly fine. I was able to get all the parts supplied to me one way or the other. And one thing I want to mention as well is another resource for particularly the hardware, which is a very well-known person in the Mattel Aquarius group, which is Sean Harrington. He's been invaluable to me in supplying me some of the programmed parts to build my own micro-expander, as well as I have another Mattel Aquarius computer that I was attempting to do some upgrades on myself, and I kind of botched it along the way, I guess, because the computer stopped working at some point. So I've actually shipped it off to Sean to take a look at, to see if he's able to help me figure out what's wrong with it at the moment. And at the same time, I might get him to do some upgrades to it, because he offers some amazing services for people who have their own actual Mattel Aquarius computer that they may want to get upgraded. He currently offers services to upgrade the video circuitry, so you can have him install composite video circuit board. You can, I think he also offers an HDMI video upgrade package, as well as I think you can also get a composite video kit that you could install yourself. And he may also offer other services, such as upgrading the capacitors and maybe replacing the power module with a more efficient type. I'm not sure exactly what all services he offers, but again, I'll put a link to his website down below as well in the video description, in case you want to check out any hardware upgrade options that he might offer that you might be interested in. Which brings me back to the question of, should we actually buy one of these computers for doing game development? Well, the first question really is, do we need to buy a physical computer to do game development for the Mattel Aquarius? And the answer is no, we don't, because we have all these fantastic tools available to us. We have the emulator available to us that not only emulates the Mattel Aquarius, but it also emulates the micro-expander module. So really, we don't actually need to purchase an actual physical Mattel Aquarius computer in order to do game development. And we don't even need to purchase a micro-expander to do game development. We can simulate or emulate all of these features using the emulator on our regular PC computers. Now, of course, you might want to get an actual physical computer to do your final testing on, just to make sure that everything works on the hardware the same way that it does in the emulator. And there is one feature, I think, that the emulator currently does not yet have, which is the ability to load programs and data onto the emulated micro-expander USB stick. So in the game that I'm developing, my game can automatically load in screens from the emulated USB stick. It can also automatically load in other games or programs if I want to. So we can have a program that's running automatically load in another program when it gets to the end. So you can make a game that takes up, let's say, 32K of memory, and then when that game is finished, you can have that game automatically load in another level of the game, which could take up another 32K of memory. So we can really now create huge, expansive games for the Mattel Aquarius, and using, of course, these cool features given to us by these new tools that we have available and new hardware upgrades available at our disposal. But like I was saying, the one feature that the emulator currently doesn't have, the AquaLite Emulator, is the feature to be able to save data to the USB stick. So although the real hardware does allow you to save data using the built-in USB basic version that comes with the micro-expander, so I think if you have the real hardware and a real micro-expander, you can have your games automatically save data to the USB stick, but I don't think that functionality is currently being emulated in the AquaLite Emulator. So while I think it is a fantastic development environment for beginners to now try to develop games for, because we no longer have to design our own graphics. We have the built-in graphics character set we can use to make our own games. Using character graphics can be simpler than using bitmapped graphics to try to display graphics on the screen. So I think it's a really cool way to at least experiment for beginners to develop games for the Mattel Aquarius. All you need to do is download and install the AquaLite Emulator and start developing your own games. The user manual for the Aquarius is available online as well, and I'll put a link to that as well. I'll have to try to remember all these links I need to put in the video description, but that really shows you what incredible tools and resources are available to people wanting to develop games for the Mattel Aquarius. So if you're a beginning programmer wanting easy entry into game development, I highly suggest taking a look at the Mattel Aquarius emulator, the AquaLite Emulator, at least to begin with, before considering buying the actual hardware. And if you do decide to buy the hardware, again, Sean Harrington does currently offer these hardware upgrade services that you may be interested in, as well as we have resources available for building our own micro-expander modules. And you can buy the boards online, you can buy the parts online. You might have to do some programming of the parts. You might have to experiment with getting parts that aren't fake and making sure you get the right version of certain parts. I may in the future make a video showing how to actually build one of these micro expanders. I'm not sure yet. I have one more kit that I might build up, because when you buy the parts to build a micro expander, well, particularly when you buy the boards, you can't just buy one set of boards. As far as I'm aware, you have to buy 3 sets of boards. So if you're going to buy 3 sets of boards, you may want to just buy 3 sets of parts and build up 3 complete units, which is what I did anyway. I have enough parts to build 3 of these units. So I may make a video on building my last unit. I'm not sure yet. So there you go. I just wanted to give you an introduction to the Mattel Aquarius computer and what I've learned about it, and why I find it so exciting now with the potential for game development, given these new modern tools, these amazing tools that we now have at our disposal. So that's it for today. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.